Hello, my name is Peter Conley. I'm the chair of the Addison Central School District Board. Before we get moving along here, I just want to take a moment to have the rest of the board members who are in attendance tonight stand up, in part so you can all see who they are, because many of us will be milling about after the presentation tonight in case you have questions or want to chat about something. But with the board members who are here, please stand up, say hello to the audience. With the exception of the folks in the middle. But you're welcome to chat with them as well. Anyway, many of us will be sticking around afterward if you have any further questions. So welcome. This is a presentation tonight with a chock full of information. This is the first time the board will be hearing a lot of what's being presented tonight, and a lot of it is based on documents that are available on our website, and we have a rather filled agenda with this information, and we do have some time at the end if folks have some questions as we go through. So, I'm going to start off tonight just talking a little bit about the board's facilities master plan process, but then we'll quickly get into the information part of the presentation. Beginning with a look at where we are today fiscally, some of the demographic pressures that we're facing, not just here, but really throughout rural Vermont, throughout, in fact, rural North America. That's going to be with our superintendent and our business manager. And then we'll turn our attention to what I think many folks came here to hear as well, and that is a report from our facilities committee about the process that we've been going through and what the process will be going forward, using the data that was collected over the past several months by our architect and engineering firm, who we tasked with going out and getting a good inventory of our schools, and what they have, and what we'll be using as we go forward with this study. Let's see. So everybody knows the slides tonight, you'll see especially the school-specific slides. There's a lot of information on them. They'll all be available on our website if you don't want to wade through the 400-page in-depth analysis of each of the schools. In addition, the flyer that everybody was given on the way in also has a lot of information. Many of the slides you'll see tonight are in there as well. Talks about things moving forward, talks about the board's process, and talks about, if you have further questions in the future, how those can be handled. Again, tonight is really going to be a major presentation of information from our finances, from the demographics to the school-specific information that will come afterwards. But mainly, a big thanks for coming out on a kind of a cold, dreary night. There's a lot of other things going on, but we really appreciate people being here. The last few months, the board's been spending a lot of time going to different towns and speaking with people. Folks, I just want to say, have been incredibly receptive, welcoming, thoughtful, and it's really been a positive process for us to both help folks understand where we are, but also for us to learn about where they are. So the board has a constant challenge in the back of its head. We are a young, unified school district. It really became unified 3 years ago. And so one thing that we have to keep in the back of our minds is exactly this. How do we work together across all of our diverse communities to provide the best for our students within the fiscal realities of our district and of our state? And I think, you know, as we think about our diverse communities, I think we probably see it here. We've got folks from big towns, big town, and small towns. We have folks from communities that have a high poverty rate and communities that don't. We are, in many ways, a very unique district from across the state in that, you know, we have a large shire town, and it is surrounded by small towns. Most school districts have a much more balanced population, and we have great socioeconomic diversity. It's really, it's quite interesting when you go about comparing, because many districts are sort of going through the same process, but we all have our different realities. So the facilities master plan process began several years ago, and it was really with a purpose to think about the future. We knew hard decisions were coming. We could see what was going on, the budget increases with declining population, and the real purpose here is to be thoughtful and proactive and not in a position where we are reacting to crisis and having to make decisions that aren't thoughtful and take time and take community input. So we have been on this road, and I'll go a little bit further into where we have been and where we're going. But we are certainly gathering a lot of information. And a lot of that information is, supporting the fact that we have fiscal challenges, we have goals that we want to achieve with our students in terms of equity and performance. And I think that this last line here is our goal is really to align those realities with our vision for our students. And part of our vision is for equity and also sustaining a program that we're very proud of and that we want to continue to be proud of. Excuse me. So I'll go through this briefly. Many of you have been to our presentations. Many of you have been part of our community forums. Many of you have been following this through various publications, including our website. But we began talking about this in the academic year 2017-2018. But really it was in the summer of 2018 that the board had a retreat and said that this facilities master plan process was something that was what we needed to focus on. And it was a unanimous decision by the board. And at that point, we really set forth an agenda that we have since broken. We thought we could come up with a facilities master plan really within 1 year. And we are beyond that and halfway through our second year, because one of the things we realized is that we needed more information, we needed more time with the community. So the process began with us creating our own process to how we were going to go through this. We had a steering committee lined up to help us through the public portion of that, kind of creating a format to get the public involved. And that began in the fall of 2018 when we had a series of 3 public forums. Well-attended, great conversation. It was really sort of talking more generally about the district and our goals and our realities. And then the board went back to work, went into a little more specifics about what we felt we needed to do and what we felt the realities were that we needed to face. And again, returned to the public in the spring of 2019 with another series of 3 public forums. Again, well-attended, good conversation. We took a lot of input not only at those meetings, but also emails, letters, on the fly suggestions. The board basically spent the summer kind of taking that and figuring out next steps. So one of the things that came out of a lot of that public forum work was a real desire to have more detailed, better information about our schools and what our inventory is and the pros and cons of what we have. So really, since the beginning of the school year, we've had architectural and engineering firms going through our schools so that we can all have a better sense of that. And it wasn't just for that purpose, but we also know that we are a district of many aging buildings. A lot of them were built in the 60s or earlier, and we know that for whatever reason, deferred maintenance has been accumulating in each of our buildings. I really think that represents a decision by many of our boards to invest in people rather than in buildings. And that has allowed us to maintain a very robust, excellent academic program, but at a certain point, we have to look at our buildings and see what they need. So again, we've had a lot of this expert inventory done on our buildings. You're going to hear a lot more about that tonight. And that's really where we're at. So looking forward, this is a look at the board and the board's work. These are dates that we have board meetings. And so here we are tonight on January 27th with the presentation. We have a budget vote to get through. We have a public hearing on our budget with a presentation on the 25th of February. That's also our annual meeting. But of course, the budget vote actually takes place on Tuesday town meeting day by Australian ballot. Getting into March, we're going to, Victoria, Jenny, a board member on the Facilities Committee, will talk more about this. We'll be hearing more about the elementary schools and some proposals for configuration. And then we move into really looking at evaluating the information that we have in an objective way and then continuing our work. And again, I just want to emphasize, this is what the board is going to be doing with its time in board meetings, but doesn't necessarily speak to the community engagement portion of what we're working on. And you know, as we get ourselves more in line with what we are looking at doing, at the same time we will also be working on our community involvement, community engagement portion of that. So anyway, this is where we're at. And just to, you know, to talk about a few things that I hear in the community, you know, we do not have a proposal yet. What we have now today is information. And we're going to use that information as best we can to come up with our proposal for the community to talk about. This slide, by the way, is in the flyer, so if you can't memorize all the dates, there you go. So we have a lot of information to present tonight and a limited time for questions and answers, but what I do want to say is there's more opportunity. We have an email address that we've been having questions go to. If you haven't seen it, if you have questions, we also have a frequently asked questions section on the ACSDVT.org website. It's long, but there's a lot of really good questions, most of them generated from the community with the answers on there. Tonight there will also be index cards you can fill out with questions to leave. And as I said, many of us board members will be kicking around afterward if you want to chat further about it. But with that in mind, I'm going to hand the microphone over to Superintendent Peter Burrows as we continue our presentation.
Good evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our kind of like the high level demographic and financial data that Brittany then is going to talk about in more depth. But before I do that, I do want to talk about our strengths. And I think one of the challenges of this process in looking at where we are financially and looking at resources and kind of where we head is it's really easy to start to forget everything we do have. And for those of you that have lived in other places and have not experienced some of what's happening in the 49 other states, I can tell you, having grown up in Connecticut and also having done a lot of work in Oregon, superintendents in those states are fighting tooth and nail to get half of what we have financially in Vermont. When I first moved here 7 years ago, I was startled to find that our amount of spending per pupil was over double what it was in Oregon. And the ability to do anything in a learning community where morale is so low because there isn't enough money to fund education is really, really challenging. And it's what actually drove our family, other than having family in New England, it's what drove us to this state specifically. So I think we're amiss if we, with the tension that is involved in this conversation, with what Peter talked about in terms of the tension we inherently have had prior to this with having one large town and lots of small towns, if we get lost in that and we can't remember what we have, we're going to lose a lot. And so I just want to put that out there, that I think it's really, really important that we don't lose sight of community and we don't lose sight of vision. And we have incredible vision in this community. We're doing great work in our schools. At the end of this year, we're going to be, I believe, the 9th school in the country that is an Ivy World District, which is huge. Not to mention a host of other things that are happening. So that work, the goal is for all of the great work that happens with our communities, with our schools to continue, but we really have to do it together. That's kind of what tonight is about, is kind of grounding everybody in the reality of where we are financially and in terms of the condition of our buildings as we look at how do we look ahead and be proactive 5, 10, 15 years as opposed to waiting every year for the budget to see where our equalized pupil number is and how much we can afford and how much we have to cut. So that's kind of, I think, a critical piece to this process and something that we have to really, really hold on to. So our challenges, these are not new things. The demographic shifts we've been seeing in Vermont have been happening over a long period of time. They are reaching a climax in a lot of places because of the excess spending threshold and the Vermont funding formula. So that's something that I'm going to talk about in a minute. Some of you probably attended, Art Wolf came to Addison County to CSAC. Did any folks attend that? Couple? Okay. It's online. I think it was covered by MCTV, correct?
Yeah.
I see a thumbs up back there. So you can go on MCTV and find that. It's pretty interesting. I think it's an hour and a half. But he kind of walks through some of the changes that are happening, both Vermont-wide and in Addison County. And I found it to be really helpful in terms of contextualizing some of what's happening. So we have seen, as you know, we have seen a pretty significant drop in the student population in Addison County. That's been pretty significant. And right now, in terms of where we are as a community, if you look at our enrollment, and we'll be talking about enrollment in a little bit, but we won't break it out by grade, but if you look at the grade level enrollment in Addison Central, our elementary grades are around 150 and 120 students. The secondary grade levels have been vacillating from about 180 to 150. We have a class of 147, the sophomores right now. So all these students, as they graduate, that's why you're seeing this decline. So we believe that this is current and future enrollment. We believe by around FY27, that's fiscal year 27, it's the 26-27 school year, that we believe will kind of be starting to settle out in terms of those numbers. So that's kind of, as we look ahead, that's what it looks like. In terms of the ed funding formula and taxation, and a lot of people are probably hearing the term double taxation or double taxed. The Vermont legislature has set a threshold, an excess spending threshold is called, which is designed to suppress spending so that districts can't just spend whatever and receive the funding for that. And that spending threshold has changed over time. It was created with Act 68, I believe. And the way that's calculated has changed over time. The way it's currently in statute is that it increases each year. That number increases each year. This is the max amount you can spend per student by the NEEP index, which is kind of like a CPI index. That goes up about 2%, 2.5% a year. So once a district reaches the point where you're at the spending threshold, the roll-up cost for most districts is around 3.5%. So once you get up to that threshold, it's very challenging to stay below it year after year. If you're also losing students, that multiplies the effect. So if your roll-up cost, which is what Brittany will share later, and I don't want to steal her thunder because I do it all the time. But if the number of students is going down, that number kind of doubles. So instead of a 3.5%, now you're looking at 5 or 6%. So those are some of the factors that we're facing. Peter mentioned this in terms of investment in facilities. There's a lot of deferred maintenance. We haven't really spent a lot of money on our buildings since they were built in the 50s and 60s. So we're in a place, and this is, again, this conversation could be happening in lots of communities in Vermont. We are not alone. Different communities are tackling these issues in different ways, but Vermonters as a whole are experiencing this, and construction aid ended in 2007 in Vermont. It used to be a 30% match to a community who put in 70%. That was on new construction, not on deferred maintenance. So there has been no support for eons in terms of supporting buildings and keeping them up to snuff. So historical enrollment, you can see here from FY10 to 20, shows the drop there. And then, as I mentioned, current and future enrollment. And this is the excess spending threshold. This is just the last 3 years. So this is the first year where we dipped down in FY19 because of the change in universal pre-K. Those students are now counted, even though most of them attend non-ACSD schools, we still count them in our student count. So it basically gave us additional students in FY19, which is why you see that drop, and now we're kind of like moving back up again. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off now to Brittany to go deep into ed funding.
Thank you. I'm Brittany Gilman, I'm the business manager. Peter did steal some of my thunder, he usually does, but I love a captive audience, so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to explain a little bit about the funding system in the state of Vermont, which will sort of help to ground us in why we are where we are and where we might be going based on the current trajectory. So in 1997, there was a court case, Brigham versus State of Vermont, and basically this caused the funding system to be what it is today. It stated that there are wide disparities in tax burdens due to large differences in property wealth, and that resulted in inequity, essentially. And so Act 60 and 68 came about, and as a result of that, the state of Vermont funds all public school district budgets. And this was an attempt to equalize demographics, spending, and student population. So we, we all bear the costs of one another's budgets. The state ed fund totals over $1.6 billion. 67% of that comes from property taxes, but only 26% from homestead property tax and 41% from the non-homestead property tax, which is non-residential. There are other sources such as sales and use, vehicle purchase and use, lottery, and rooms and meals tax, but primarily funded through property tax. So this is our FY21 tax rate calculation based on the budget that the board has adopted that we voted on in March. So the way that it works is you start with your total expenditures. So this is everything that we think it's going to cost to run the school next year or the district next year. And that's up 3.74%. We talked a lot in board meetings about why the increase is largely driven wage and benefits. Health insurance premiums are going up 12 to 13% a year, and that's driving a lot of these increases. We subtract our local revenues, which are things like state and federal grants and tuition revenues, and this equals our education spending. And this is sort of where the local control ends. Beyond that, everything's sort of a function of the formula. You divide your education spending by equalized pupils, which is a weighted to your average of enrollment. Students are weighted up if they're high school students, they're weighted down if they're pre-K students, and there's some additional weighting for ELL and poverty, and this gives us our education spending per equalized pupil. This number has to be warned on the warning, and that's increasing by 7.76% this year. So, as Peter mentioned, this is the first year that we are over the excess spending threshold, but there are certain costs that are allowed to be considered exempt, such as the VISTERS, Vermont State Teachers Retirement System costs we have related to that, as well as debt payments on eligible capital construction get to be exempted from that. So we won't be experiencing tax penalties for this number this year. That number is then divided by the property yield. That's a number set by legislature. Right now, it's an estimate. The tax commissioner puts out a letter on December 1st. Excuse me. And this number changes throughout the course of the legislative session. This is one of the mechanisms that causes this to be a statewide funding system. This helps, the state figures out how much money they need to raise in total, and that number changes based on that. And this gives us our equalized tax rate. So every town in the district has the same equalized tax rate before we apply the CLA, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And we still have the incentive rate that decreases by 2 cents every year. So the incentive rate, if you recall, during conversations of unification, is an incentive for voluntarily unifying. It started at 10 cents, and it will go down 2 cents every year until it's gone. And then we get our revised rate, which is up 6.9% this year. Next, we have to factor in our common level of appraisal, and this is a calculation for real estate values, and it's unique to each town. So if your CLA is lower than 100, it causes your rate to be higher than the district tax rate. And if it's below 100, if it's below 100, it causes it to be higher than the district tax rate. And if it's above 100, it causes it to be lower than the district tax rate. And changes year over year from the CLA can have a large impact on your tax rate. So if your CLA is going down, then it's going to cause your tax rate to go up. So you can see the towns that are seeing the largest decrease are going to see the largest increase in the tax rate. And this leads to our estimated town tax rates. So we say it's estimated for now because there can be changes in the property yield, which changes the formula. But you can see that there's a range of 10 to about 18-cent tax rate increase projected for FY21. So in predicting tax rates for future years, we need to make some assumptions. We don't know exactly what the yield will be. Obviously, we don't know exactly what our equalized pupils will be, or even what our spending will be. But we have to make some assumptions so that we can model what future years might look like. So in looking at FY22, we could be in a position where we're about $790,000 over the threshold, which would result in a 16-cent tax increase for the district rate. That's not including the CLA, which is even harder to predict. And this would result in about $478 increase for a taxpayer paying based solely on property value for a $300,000 home, and about $127 for a couple paying based on $80,000 income. And these calculations are different. 60 to 75% of the residents in Addison County pay based at least partially on income. This is an example, so I would just caution that every tax situation is different. These are some estimates. Our spending trajectory over the next 5 years, when we're looking at the excess spending threshold, increases at quite a rate. So as Peter mentioned, once you exceed the excess spending threshold, it's very difficult to come back down below it. And this is because our education spending is increasing at a higher rate than the excess spending threshold is increasing. So it gets fairly exponential. By FY26, we could be looking at a situation where we're $5 million over the threshold if we don't make any reductions. And then looking at the tax rate 5 years out, again, we have to make some assumptions based on what the property yield will be and the rates at which things will increase and decrease. But the red line shows if we don't make any reductions over the next 5 years where our tax rate could be, the district tax rate. And that's above $2.50. And the blue line shows if we make reductions to get below the excess spending threshold every year, the rate of the tax rate increase. And so we hear a lot of talk about the double tax, and I just wanted to take a second to explain what that is and what that looks like. So, excuse me, a bit of a cold. If we spend above the threshold, the number that we spend above the threshold gets added in again. And so it has the effect of a double taxation in a sense. And so that's where we use that term double tax. We're charged again for those costs. And so that's the tax penalty impact. So you can see that in FY22, about 4 cents of our tax rate increase could be as a result of exceeding the threshold. But by FY26, it's up to 31 cents. So again, this is a situation where our costs are increasing at a much higher rate than the excess spending threshold is increasing. And that leads to these big jumps. What could we reduce? So that's one of the things that we have to consider when we're looking at reducing to be under the excess spending threshold. And so 75% or so of our budget is wages and benefits. So just sort of in looking in terms of what that would mean, We would need to reduce between 13 and 16 FTE per year over the next 5 years in order to stay under the threshold. And this is based on an estimated average wage among all categories of employees. And obviously, this probably isn't even possible. We don't have enough staff to really do this, but this is an example of what it could mean in terms of FTE. I'm going to pass it over to Victoria.
Everybody take a deep breath. That's a lot. So I'm Victoria Jetty. I'm going to start first by just introducing the Facilities Committee because I think it's nice for everybody to kind of see beyond a name who your representatives are. So I'll just give a little, they don't know what I'm going to say about them, but I'll just give a little background. So first, I'm Victoria Jetty. My mother-in-law was a longtime teacher and coach in Middlebury. My husband grew up through the ACSD schools. He went to 4th and 5th grade and was at Twilight Hall and was at Mary Hogan when the D wing was just one big room with 3 teachers. I didn't arrive in Middlebury until college, but I feel that I have a real appreciation for this community, both the towns, but also the educational community. I have 3 kids, 1 in each of the Middlebury schools. Chip Malcolm is also on the Facilities Committee. He's a longtime doctor in town. His children went through the Middlebury schools, and now his grandchildren are, and he was head of the board back in the 90s when they were struggling with maintaining their I guess certification, and going for a bond to build the middle school. We've got Joy Jacobite from Shoreham. She has kids at the Shoreham School. She comes and brings the teacher's perspective because she's a teacher at Mount Abe. Peter Conlon, born in Barry, raised in Montpelier, longtime resident of Cornwall. Kids have gone through the schools. He's at one point head of the Cornwall school, FOCS, Friends of Cornwall School. Bruce McIntyre, who's our director of facilities, born in Vermont, born in Shoreham, or not, grew up in Shoreham, and graduated from NUHS, has an associate degree in sustainable building design, and has been at NUHS since 1999 as a facilities manager, and then since unification as director of facilities. Brittany Gilman, so I told you the voted members of it, but also our administrators. Brittany Gilman, who you just saw, lives in Rutland, 3 beautiful children. Anyway, so this group came together, formed in September of 2019, as you heard from Peter, because the board felt that a smaller group was better able to handle the workload and simplified working with a consultant to conduct the elementary school study. So after the full board laid the groundwork for the committee by developing guiding principles and deciding to move the 6th grade, the Facilities Committee began work assisting David to do the work in evaluating our elementary school buildings, both for how they will support our academic programming and for the physical and structural integrity and investment needs. You can see our timeline on your flyer, but briefly, our next steps between today and March are to assist David where need be as he develops recommendations for configuration options. Using his recommendations as a guide, as well as all the other information that we've been gathering over the last few months, the committee will then work on a draft of the facilities master plan. And in May, we'll come together for a dialogue on that plan, and in June, we hope to finalize it. So that's sort of roughly our timeline here till June. David will be presenting a distilled version of the elementary school study, including findings on a school-by-school basis. Afterwards, there'll be question and answer about what he's presented, and we're asking that they be sort of clarifying questions around what he's presented about his work. If you have other questions or comments, we have re-established the email address Grand Challenge. So please send your comments or questions there, as well as we have boxes laid out, pen and some paper to gather questions that we have here for you. So David Epstein hails from Shelburne. He's a managing principal at Truex Collins, where he's been since 1997. He leads the education studio at Truex in the design of K through 12 schools, locally in Vermont, across the US, and internationally. So without further ado.
Thank you, Victoria. So it's great to see such a good turnout. I know this is an important subject for a lot of people, and what we're here to do tonight is to talk about our efforts on the study and just kind of bring people up to date as to where we are in terms of that. Assisting me is Stephen Poston. He's a project manager at Truex Collins. He is going to talk about the condition of the buildings, and I'll be talking about other aspects as well. So let's get started. So as Victoria mentioned, the first part of the process was we did a workshop, visioning workshop with the board to come up with what were some of the really important things that we, guiding principles we call them, really what was their vision for this study? In other words, if we're going to analyze the schools, what are we analyzing them against? What's the ideal? And we had a great session, and this is what we came up with. I'm not going to read it word for word, but there's some key things in here that really directly address facilities. One is creating a welcoming, safe, and secure environment, promoting a sense of community. But then the second one, there was a lot of talk earlier about equity, and I think that came up loud and strong in the visioning workshop, because the idea is that every kid in the district should have access to the same resources. And that's not just facilities, but that's part of it. Then this third bullet really has a lot of impact on facilities. So the ideal school experience for elementary school included full-time staffing of both academic and support positions. Student access to a full range of academic and co-curricular offerings. And I'm going to skip down to the next to last bullet. Learning environments with an optimized number of students, not reliant on multi-age classrooms. And then I want to go to the next page. Connected to nature and a commitment to sustainability. But if we go back, the learning environments with an optimized number of students, not relying on multi-age student classrooms, full-time staffing, all point to a certain size school with a certain number of resources. And if you talk about schools come, elementary schools often come in, they don't come in 500 flavors. They usually come in a few. Traditionally, you have a 1 section per grade school or a 2 section per grade school. To have full-time staffing of like a full-time librarian, a full-time nurse in a school often requires a 2 section per grade classroom. That's about 250 kids in a school. We had a really good discussion with the board and with the facilities committee about that, and they said, that's it's not realistic in this district. Because if you look at all the schools that we have and the size of the communities, to create a 2-section per grade school is too heavy a lift. And, but in terms of matching this vision, and the other thing that was key to this was having spaces that support all of the offerings. So the board's vision. Now this is the vision. This is a positive view of what education could be. So the idea is not just to save money, but the idea is how can we make learning environments better for all the kids in the districts? Provide more resources for them and have it be more equitable. So having spaces that support all of these resources was also a key part of the vision. So out of that, we developed what we call a model program. So this is a list of the kinds of spaces that you would have in the ideal school of a 1-section per grade school. So a pre-K classroom, a kindergarten classroom, grades 1 through 5, and an extra classroom would be great. There's often a bubble coming up through a school. How do you accommodate that? Pretty typical things, a front office, a principal's office, conference room. You'd be amazed how many schools don't have conference rooms or places for people to meet. And an art room, a music room. The IB program has a foreign language component at the elementary level, so having a foreign language room. Now, it's not to say that you can't deliver art without an art room, right? Because it's being done all throughout the district right now. And it's not saying that you can't deliver a really robust program without an art room. But it's not ideal. And if you talk to any art teacher, it's really difficult, it has extra challenges. And what we're talking about here is how do we make the schools better? How do we make the learning experience better? And so you'll see a couple of things, though, that are not included. For example, under 3, makerspace, we didn't put a makerspace in there. If you look under number 4, we didn't put a cafeteria in. Most schools would kill for a cafeteria because what happens is during the school day, you lose your gym for 2 or 3 hours while you're serving lunch, or your multi-purpose room. In fact, I don't know about in this district, but in a lot of districts, kids used to go home for lunch. And so this whole you always wonder, why are there no cafeterias in elementary schools? And part of it is that kids used to go home for lunch. We're working with a school in Winooski. They didn't serve lunch there until the 90s. Now that's a walking community, it's a little different, but you can see we didn't put a space in for school-based clinicians or occupational therapy or physical therapy. So this is, there's some things in here that are quite large, like the multi-purpose room here we have sized as an elementary school gym. A lot of schools you'll see when we get into the analysis have much, much smaller spaces. They're not really true gymnasiums. They're, one of the other things that happens when you use your multi-purpose room as a cafeteria and a lot of other things is you can't really put in any kind of sports floor, any kind of floor that has any kind of resiliency because you eat in there, right? So you're not going to put a wood floor in. And often they have vinyl composition tile, which is the kind of tile you see all over schools. It's really bad for your body. It's really bad to play sports on. It's not good for kids. It's not good for adults. So anyway, that's and having said that, we see it all over Vermont when we work on schools. Also, so no OTPT. So you can see the school. What happens here is we total all of these square footages. Comes out to about 21,000 square feet. and then we multiply it by 1.4, which is a historical figure that gets you from all the spaces you accounted for, that's what buys you your wall thicknesses, your corridors, your bathrooms, your boiler rooms, all that stuff. It's called a grossing factor. It's just historically, and I'll show you what the grossing factor is for your current schools, which is more like 1.3. Generally when we see 1.3, we're like, that's a tight school with not a lot of elbow room. 1.4 is a much better planning number. So we came up with this, and then you'll see we've done an analysis where we look at each school relative to this model program. This is your district map. This is where the schools exist currently, and those are the enrollments less the 6th graders in them. And I put some distances here, thanks to Google Maps. So from Weybridge to Mary Hogan, it's about 3.6 miles. Cornwall to Mary Hogan, 4.6. The longest distance was interesting, was Bridport to Cornwall, depending on Google's preferred route. I don't know the area that well, because it showed a shorter route, but I was guessing that was probably like not passable certain times of the year. So, you know, the longest distance, this 10.1 miles, was about 15-minute drive. Now this doesn't account for like that somebody might live back here in Ripton. So this is just school to school. But it's just kind of interesting to see, like, you know, most of the drives were much shorter than 15 minutes between the schools. So that's the district, that's what that looks like. Oops. So now we're going to get into each school. So the way this presentation works is that there's a general slide about each school, and then there's a slide that shows major issues. Then there's a slide that talks about costs, and Stefan's going to talk about those. And then there's an analysis where we look at each school relative to the model program. And then finally a slide that talks about potential for redevelopment. What are some of the pluses and minuses for each school? So we're going to take you through each school, and then at the end we'll have a summary that kind of has some graphics that show all of them together, so we can kind of look at it together. So why don't we get started, Steph?
Thank you, David. So back in October, Bruce McIntyre, head of facilities for the district, led myself and a team of engineers through each school, elementary school in the district. We spent about a half a day at each facility, a little more at Mary Hogan. And what we were able to do was get into the facilities, sort of get in the way of the teachers and students a little bit. We thank you for your cooperation in that. And then take a look at what we could see with each school. We didn't do any destructive testing. We didn't poke holes in any walls or do anything like that. So what we could see is sort of how we were able to come up with our assessment. And then of course there was some research done in floor plans and existing documents, as well as in looking at existing wastewater permits, for example. How is the school permitted? So we start with Bridport, a fairly large school in the district at 17,500 square feet. It has a nice big 19.5 acre lot, which is mostly flat. Very nice lot to work on, very nice playground. Seems like it has adequate parking, and about 83 occupants. And what you might notice here is the difference between this number and the previous slide with the district map. The previous slide showed essentially K through 5 students at each school, with the exception of Mary Hogan, or maybe that was including Mary Hogan. And then this shows actual current occupants at the school. That would be full-time staff, students, even accounting for some part-time staff.
And the reason why that sometimes is important is because the wastewater permit is based on the total occupants, not the students. So we wanted to include that number.
So as we go through these slides, it might look like we're picking on each school a little bit. Certainly not our intent. What we saw there was a lot of good and a lot of potential, but we do need to point out sort of what needs to be done at each school. What should be done to repair what's broken, to bring up to snuff what's worn out, to replace things that need to be replaced, in order to be in line with current energy codes, current accessibility codes, current building standards. So at Bridport, some of the things that we saw indicative of some site drainage issues. There were some damaged culverts and drains. Some of the underground infrastructure has started to shift and heave a little bit, which shows that it needs a little bit of work on site drainage. Damaged brick and mortar, you can see in the top left photo there, just sort of common thing across schools of this age. Built in the mid-1950s, there is going to be some damage to the outside, to the brick and to the mortar. An inefficient thermal envelope, we refer to essentially the skin of the building. That includes the siding, the insulation, the roof, the windows, as the envelope. And those, of course, are designed to keep the cold out, to keep the warm in, vice versa in the summertime. Older schools like this tend to have a lack of or very little insulation, very inefficient windows that may need replacing or have been replaced since, but again are aging because it's been about 20, 25 years since they've been worked on. So certainly an inefficient thermal envelope is a concern just for occupant comfort and in the learning environment, as well as in the costs involved in maintaining the interior atmosphere of the building. As you can see in the top right photo, there is some exposed asbestos flooring, as well as it started to chip away, so you actually see some exposed asbestos adhesive, which is a concern and should be addressed, encapsulated, covered up, or removed by somebody who's qualified to do that work. Insufficient fire protection, this is something we saw district-wide. Most of the buildings are not fully sprinklered, and there is a lack in some cases of both detection and warning equipment. And that would be detectors, horn strobes, flashing lights, whatever it may be that's needed to warn occupants of a fire. And then in the bottom left, you can see just an example of a classroom sink with limited ADA access. In other words, there's limited availability for a child or an adult in the school in a wheelchair or with other mobility, vision, or other issues, difficulties to be able to successfully navigate the building and use all of the facilities that are available to other occupants.
And this is pretty typical in schools of this age, because they were last renovated before 1991, let's say, before ADA. You can even see some doorknobs here. You need to have lever hardware in schools. So, the school has what we call a certificate of occupancy, right? So what happens is, the way it works is that, once you get one, as long as you maintain the building to some level, you get grandfathered in, your certificate of occupancy continues. When you do a project of a certain size, though, then that becomes the hook where Division of Fire Safety says, okay, now you have to upgrade your fire alarm system. For example, now in schools you have to do voice notification, so no more alarms. There's a voice. It's actually great. A voice says, please proceed to the nearest exit. And in terms of a school population, and I'm talking about the teachers, they love it because it's, having that thing blaring at you. So that's the kind of thing, or sprinklering is the kind of thing where Division of Fire Safety, when you start to touch a building in any kind of significant way, that's what triggers some of these significant upgrades.
Okay, so we were able to take our assessment and the assessments of our engineering team, pass those along with photos and whatever documentation we were able to find, and give that to an estimator to come up with a reasonable estimate of essentially bringing the building as it is up to current standards.
And that concludes our presentation.
So what that would include are the actual materials, labor, and what's known as soft costs or project costs, design, taxes, insurance, that sort of thing, involved with doing any work on a public building such as this. What these numbers don't include are permits, There would be building permits, of course, with the state, as well as any potential local permits. Insulation upgrades, that one is key, simply because each building has its own unique envelope. Some are brick, some are made of masonry, some are made of steel or wood. A different approach would have to be taken with each building, depending on what it's made out of and what its condition is, to try to get it up to current standards. So insulation upgrades are not included, though new windows and that sort of thing would be included in this price. Hazardous material mitigation, for example, taking care of the asbestos flooring is not something that's included in this price. And then any additions or renovations to the school itself. In other words, this price is to take the school as it is and bring it up to current standards in its interior materials, lighting, fire alarms, etc.
So this is the analysis that we have done with each school relative to the model program. We call this a heat map. And so what the green color means is that it includes the space that's in the model program, and it's actually the same size or bigger than the model. The yellow color means it does include the space, but it's smaller than the model. Now, we debated, should we have two different color yellows, like it's barely under the standard or it's way under the standard, but you know, this is just a graphic tool for us to all kind of get a quick look at it. So you'll see, like here, the front office is slightly undersized based on the model. No big deal, right? Front office still works. However, if you look at the multi-purpose room, it's less than half the size of a real gym. More concern is the reds, where it just doesn't exist at all. So, for example, this has, these classrooms, and this is based on how it's currently used now, right? This is not, we had the district go and mark up every single floor plan and tell us how is it used just now. So, for example, there is an art room in this building. And obviously that could become a classroom, and that could become a classroom, but then you'd have to do something with a staff room and you wouldn't have an art room. There's no music room, there's no foreign language. You can see the library is quite a bit undersized. Now, the population of this school is quite a bit less than 150, or a one section per grade school. So, you might not need a library this big. So, as I said, this is a tool just to kind of say, how does it measure up against the ideal? You can see here, the building is 17,622 square feet, and that is the net, the 13,471, so its multiplier is 1.31. So you can see it's quite a bit smaller than if we were to say, okay, we want to make Bridport into a one section per grade school. You can see there'd be quite a bit of space that would need to be added to meet this ideal of the model program.
David, is the modeling, what's the assumption about class size in that model?
We use the district's class size, and then we use, basically the way it works is you say, okay, let's say 22 kids is the maximum class size, and you multiply that by a number. So usually for kindergarten it's 50 square feet per student, and for elementary 35, and you come up with a number, and we add a little bit for like casework and stuff like that, and that's the number. It's all very mechanical. Every single one of these has, so art rooms, right? Art rooms are 50 square feet per student. Kindergarten and pre-K are 50 square feet per student. So we simply took whatever the district's guidelines were for maximum number of children and multiplied that by those standards.
So the assumption is 22 students per grade?
Is it 22 or?
Lower at kindergarten and then it goes up.
Yeah, I think it was, lower kindergarten and pre-K. Pre-K was like 15. anyway, it's lower for the littles and higher for the bigs.
And with this slide, we're trying to convey how we feel each site, sort of apart from the building, has for potential. How are these sites for their potential for growth, for future development? How well can they be used? How easily can they be used? So we have several pluses here for Bridgeport, including the fact that it is a large site. Its proximity to Route 22A is great. It has municipal water service. The permit does not list its capacity, so that's something that would have to be investigated, but it is there. We have an unknown capacity for wastewater design. However, there is a large septic system on the site. As we saw, though, there's limited stormwater management with some of the heaving of the site and the infrastructure underneath it. And our civil engineers found a reference to an uncommon animal species on site. So at some point, somebody reported an endangered or uncommon animal species on site, which simply means that before any work is done on this site, some additional investigation would have to take place. We don't.
Could have been a third grader, right? So we took a little bit of time on the first one to kind of go through. There's be a lot of recurring themes, so we'll try and speed it up.
I have a question about the model comparison.
Yeah.
You said that the costs were bringing it up to standards, which I assume is meant to code for various things, but the model seems like it goes beyond code, and I was wondering, is this a model that Truex Collins has developed? Is this a model that is unique for ACSD developed by the board's impact? And I mean, is everything in the model school attested in at least one of the facilities that we're talking about? Or are we talking about no elementary school already has a separate book storage room, but if they all had one, this is what we would like to see?
Yeah, so the question is the model reflective of a school in the district, or is it an ideal?
I mean, anything, does it exist in the district, in any school?
In this district?
In this district, or are...
Well, we'll see. Actually, when we get into it, you'll see some schools get none of the schools match up exactly, but some schools get closer than others, and so we'll see. It was developed with the facilities committee and with the administration. So we said, okay, like for example, the cafeteria. We put a cafeteria in there, and they said, no. Like, take it out. We'll that will become that'll be a whole evening of conversation in itself. So there was definitely some up and back about what should be in it, and it's really just a way to if we're going, what we wanted to do is start with the guiding principles, develop a model program that reflected the guiding principles, and then just take a look at these schools relative to that ideal model program. So that's how, and then we use standards, as I mentioned, class sizes that came from the district, square footage standards that are industry standards per student, and then put this together.
So then if any of these particular items from the model were to be struck, would that drastically change the analysis outcomes?
Well, that's, yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would change the outcome of the whole study.
Would it change the perspective that we have of the individual buildings? I mean, when you design...
Well, I'll let you all make that decision when we look at the, I don't want to reveal too much too early, but, there's certain spaces that almost none of the schools have, and it's not really up to the board and the community to decide, is that okay? Is it okay, for example, if we don't have a music room in our elementary school and the music teacher goes around on a cart or teaches it in the PE, and like I said, you can deliver a perfectly, I'm not saying that, we're not saying that the music program or the art program isn't great or good or whatever. It's just we're trying to talk about, this is a vision for the future that reflects what could be and what would make an optimum learning environment for students. So that's where this is coming from.
Excuse me.
Yeah,
excuse me.
It really is, we were creating a yardstick, right, for the program. We're not saying this is the school that we envision is going to be built in this spot. This is just, here's the yardstick, let's see how it compares to it.
I've been asked to remind everyone, we will have a question and answer period right after we get through this presentation.
Okay. So let's get into, so we're gonna start speeding it up because there's 7 schools to go through.
Okay.
So you're on.
Right into Cornwall, Bingham Memorial School. Again, a good-sized school with 13,500 square feet. A nice lot, 20 parking spaces in a gravel lot, which didn't seem to be over full when we visited, and about 98 occupants as reported by the district. Again, this is going to start to look familiar. We see some damaged brick and mortar on the outside. We see a thermal envelope that is essentially uninsulated in most of the walls, so there was insulation in the roof. We see flooring that is asbestos flooring that is exposed and is starting to deteriorate. Fire protection, again, horn strobes, alerts, and even detection equipment somewhat lacking. Accessibility is somewhat limited, and some electrical deficiencies were noted throughout. And so we see repair and upgrade costs, again, to bring the building up in place to modern standards would be just over $2 million.
So let's do our little analysis again. So here you can see there's a fair amount of, there's no pre-K classroom. The kindergarten classroom's a little undersized. Grade 3 is a little undersized, but 1 and 2 are fine. There's a decent amount of classrooms here. Very small front office, very small principal's office, no conference room, no mail or copy area. There is an art room, which could be, once again, could be used for grade 4 here, but would leave you with no art room. And then, no music room, no art storage, no. Here you can see a very small library, no book room, no stage. The kitchen is really small. And then you can see here, in terms of those kind of student support spaces, not a lot. And so here's, once again, that multiplier for this school is about 1.3.
And so, again, Cornwall School is a nice site. It has a good permitted wastewater capacity. The septic mound is aging and it should be investigated. Its distance from major routes, it's along Route 30. Taking a look at the other major routes through the district, 22A and 7, it sort of sits between them. Again, the proximity here isn't very far, but in comparison with some of the other schools, it's a bit far. The drainage of the soil is poor, though there haven't been too many issues on site. It's not permitted for stormwater, which would have to be addressed if any work were to be done. And there is a drilled well, but we don't know its gallons per minute capacity. Moving on to Mary Hogan School, the largest school in the district. 72,500 square feet with a big lot, plenty of parking, and lots of kids. Mary Hogan is somewhat unique in that there tend to be more stages, more ages of construction here than at the other schools. So where we find some areas are great, other areas certainly are in need of attention. There is some damaged siding, there's some damage to the roofs. The thermal envelope in certain areas is inefficient and would need to be brought up. Fire protection is, again, a common story throughout. Insufficient emergency lighting, lighting the path to emergency exits is not all there, would need to be addressed and added to. And some poor air circulation in some of the older areas of the building. We were able to take some measurements, and there were some elevated, not dangerous, but certainly some higher than average levels of carbon dioxide in the air. Could be attributed to active third graders in the room. So that would need to be further investigated. But it did speak to, and it did go hand in hand with the aging infrastructure that was providing the air circulation in some of the older areas. There certainly was less efficiency and less ability to provide fresh air to certain areas.
You can see here, this is what they call a unit ventilator. very common in schools of this age. It's a heater, and it takes fresh air from the outside, heats it up, brings it in. Essentially, you have one in every room. You have a hole in your wall in every room. They're loud. Each one of them has a separate motor and fan, and there's no heat recovery ventilation. So there's no heat recovery. So modern ventilation systems provide heat recovery, which uses the exhaust air to preheat the incoming air, so it's quite a bit more efficient. What I'm describing is very, very common in these old schools, and we see that here. I mean, almost everything we see here is pretty typical in schools of this age.
So repair and upgrade costs for Mary Hogan on a whole would be just over $7 million, again, including materials, labor, and soft costs. And we find that this, comparing the square footage of Mary Hogan with the square footage of all the other schools, tends to roughly equal out. The size of the school does, in fact, increase its repair and rework, or repair and upgrade costs in line with all of the other schools that we've seen.
So we know this building's of a different ilk in terms of size than the other ones, but we did the same analysis, and you'll see a lot of green, and so it does have an art room, it does have art storage and music room and music storage, it does have a foreign language classroom. So there are examples of schools in the district that do have some of these spaces that are better resourced from a facility standpoint to serve the program that the district is trying to deliver. So it does exist. You can see here also the multiplier is a bit higher, which starts to mean more generous corridors, lobbies, and ancillary spaces. It does not have a cafeteria. Its stage is really small, so on and so forth. It's not perfect, but and we're just trying to show you. Somebody asked, do these spaces exist anywhere in the district? They do.
So at Mary Hogan, what we found is that it does have a central location in the district. It has a large site. It's on municipal water and sewer. It's permitted for plenty of infrastructure space or capacity for water and sewer. There are some questionable soils and poor drainage on the site. So it's what's listed as urban soils, which essentially means earth that's been impacted by human activity. So any work on the site would have to include some investigation into the quality of the soils before more work was done. Ripton is, again, about an average size for the schools, just about 15,000 square feet. It has a nice large lot, a sizable parking lot, plenty of parking. We had no trouble finding parking or seeing extra parking when we were there. And it's listed as having about 70 occupants. This school is a bit newer than some of the others. So what we saw mostly had to do with finishes, some having to do with windows. The finishes are worn. It gets traffic from kiddos every day, and so that's what we see there. It is like the others in that the fire protection is somewhat lacking and would need to be upgraded. Some limited ADA access, some insufficient emergency lighting. Some areas had slightly elevated levels of carbon dioxide in the rooms, nothing to cause concern, but something that would indicate that perhaps air circulation isn't as good as it could be. And then, as you can see, a rather small kitchen to work with to feed the kids. So what we're seeing at Ripton is $1.1 million or so to bring it up to current standards.
Can I just go back to that for just a second? Why do we not factor in hazardous material mitigation when they're often connected to a major driving factor? This school's 1989. So I'm guessing there's probably not much here, whereas some of the other schools, I mean, that could skew that construction number
Yeah, I mean, so the question is why are hazardous materials costs factored into the costs? Because it could skew the amount quite a bit. Our general experience is that, you know, a lot of the schools, what we saw here, what we've seen in other schools, you know, there has been work done to mitigate asbestos. There are some areas left. It's usually a small portion of the overall cost. It's not like, it doesn't double the cost. It might add, you know, 5% or 3%. It would require another consultant to come in and make that assessment and do a cost estimate on that. And so that was sort of, you know, which could be done, but we didn't feel, because we haven't seen it affect the budget that much, that we didn't feel that it was necessary at this time.
So based on what you've seen, you're saying the weight and prevalency of it is not high enough to factor in most of the schools?
Correct. Now that's for the stuff we can see. For example, we work on schools all over the state. We're finding PCBs in the caulk around the windows. In some schools, you just, you know, if you want to go, you'd have to go test you know, do a sampling of windows and sample the soils. And there's also this urban soils issue, which most schools in this district wouldn't have. To actually quantify that, you know, the testing gets elaborate, it's expensive, and you know, I think what would happen is if we, as we start to narrow down and look at reorganization proposals, it may be that then there's more investigation done on the schools that might get additions and things like that. But to do them for 7 schools, it was just sort of outside of the scope for now. So here's the heat map for Ripton. Ripton has 4 classrooms. They're actually nice and large. Right now, I think they're all multi-age classrooms. Does not have, you know, so it has 4 classrooms, and does not have art or music. Has a pretty big library for a school that size. Small multi-purpose room. You know, has a nurse's office and has a special ed area, but you can see missing a lot of the specials. It's one of the smaller schools, I think, although this number doesn't seem to line up with the number we looked at before. We'll have to check that. Okay, so
what we see on Ripton is it has a large, beautiful site, plenty of well water permitted capacity. Its relative remoteness compared with the other schools could be seen as a negative. Its permitting for wastewater is slightly limited. Certainly that's something that would have to be investigated, looked into, and possibly re-permitted if any work were to be done. And there's limited stormwater management on site in place, though based on what we saw, there didn't seem to be many drainage issues. There were a couple of areas of standing water, but not really much to be concerned about. Salisbury Community School, as you can see, built in 1996. One of the newer schools, I think maybe the newest school in the district. One of the larger schools at 24,500 square feet. A large lot, lots of parking, and about 110 total people in the building at this time. What we did see were some heaving sidewalks. This picture on the top right starts to capture it. This is at sort of a secondary entrance or one of the emergency exits. Some stormwater management issues on site result in water pooling in this area and then heaving the sidewalk, which in and of itself isn't a huge problem, except that this is one of the 2 major ingresses and egresses from the building, and so certainly that could present a hazard or an issue for somebody who is, say, in a wheelchair. Failing door hardware, we saw throughout the building that the nice big solid core wood doors were actually overstressing their hinges, which caused operational issues with each of the doors. Some of them just don't want to latch anymore. Some uneven lighting levels. It sounds like there was a lighting initiative done in the recent past for efficiency. However, occupant comfort with the lighting levels has suffered as a result of this. And then, as with most of the other schools, some missing fire alarm devices. So we see Salisbury's needing about $1.5 million worth of work to bring it up to current standards.
So looking at the heat map, you can see they have a fair amount of classrooms, quite large classrooms. They actually, one of the few schools with a conference room. They don't have art room or music room, but they do have storage for that. They are one of the schools with a very large multi-purpose room or gym, very close to the sizes, and they do have storage. The kitchen is, bigger than other schools, but still on the small side. And they do have some support spaces, like school-based clinicians, guidance nurse, so on and so forth.
For potential on the site, we see that it does have a large site. It has a good proximity to Route 7. It's well permitted for wastewater. It has adequate water capacity. Stormwater infrastructure is in place, though it does need some work. There are wetlands and an endangered species observed on the site. That's more on the eastern end of the site, closer to Route 7, which may or may not impact any future development of the site. Shoreham Elementary School, we see, is built in the mid-50s with a new roof, as you can see, added in 2001. Just under 15,000 square feet with a large shared site. 20 parking spaces seem to be adequate at the time. About 108 total occupants, so that's under its wastewater permitted capacity and adequate stormwater management. So some issues are a question of the roof's structural integrity, and that's not to say that the roof is going to collapse, but rather that when we investigated the roof, there were some connections up there in some of the light gauge framing that had come loose, and we need that to be investigated further before any work were to be done on any of the walls below. In fact, we had available to us at the time sort of a limited number of drawings of the building. However, some folks from the community have pointed out that they did find some additional drawings, and so we're having Bruce collect those for us, and we'll take a look at those to make sure that we have a clearer and more complete picture of the situation there. Some poor air circulation. There was at least one classroom that was sort of in the center of the building that had higher levels of CO2 than others. Some low lighting levels in some areas. The windows, indicative of their age, are inefficient. The insulation system as well. The parking, again, 20 spaces is not a lot, though we were able to find spots when we were there. But certainly any work to the building would want to address the parking situation to make sure that there was more of that. And then there's some failure of the slab in the multi-purpose room. As you can see, this is an epoxy floor that was poured in the multi-purpose room, and now it has bubbled. So there is water vapor, essentially. There's pressure coming up through the floor. And that would need to be taken out to be investigated to see whether that could be affixed by some moisture mitigation, or whether some potential cracks in the slab would have to be filled and mitigated. So we see at Shoreham just under $2 million to bring it up to current standards.
One of the things I wanted to point out was you can see there's several classrooms in this school that are interior to the building with no access to natural light. So here's the heat map for Shoreham. You can see here there's a certain number of classrooms. There's no pre-K. There's the extra classrooms not there. No conference room, no art rooms, no music rooms. The library actually is quite large relative to the model. And once again, some of these spaces are undersized. And then some of these other learning support, although the SPED is pretty close, and I think probably a lot of these are in that space.
And so at Shoreham, we see that it has a nice location in its town center. It has access to municipal utilities. It's well permitted for water and wastewater. The site slope does present some challenges. There's essentially a slope right to the west of the site, which, if I was a kid again, I would have loved to have that playground. We have to take a slide down to the playground. It's great, but as far as potential for the site, it does create some relatively large challenges to being able to expand or add on to or reconfigure. And then, of course, some lacking of access to natural light in some of the classrooms. And last but not least, Weybridge, which has had several additions over the years, starting in 1961 through 1996, about 15,500 square feet, nice big lot, seemingly plenty of parking spaces and occupancy of about 65. So there are some retaining walls out front, some site retaining walls as part of the landscaping features that have become unstable over the years and would need to be addressed. The sort of ski jump shaped roof overhang at the front has started to fail as far as it's getting water infiltration. The structure there is steel, so it doesn't present a huge concern about rotting wood structure, but certainly this is something that would need to be addressed, probably reconfigured, so that drainage off the roof could adequately take place and prevent this from happening in the future. Some in the older wing exposed asbestos flooring. Again, inadequate fire detection and alarm coverage. And then, of course, many older windows that really should be replaced. And so for Weybridge, we see about $1.5 million to bring it up to current standards.
And the heat map, pretty similar, we kind of repeating what we've said before, and we'll have a graphic that will show you all of them together, which I think is pretty illustrative. And we'll make this presentation available on the district website or however they want to do it, so people can look at it a little more carefully.
And so at Weybridge, we see that it does have a nice large site. It has wastewater infrastructure in place. The freshwater well is shared with neighboring residences, which could present challenges down the road where any redevelopment, additions, and whatnot take place. It is somewhat remote just in comparison with other schools in the district, though again, none of them are very far from the other. And some limited stormwater management on site that may need to be addressed before anything else was done.
One of the reasons we look at the wastewater permit is you see it's permitted for 102 people. Obviously, if this becomes a school that gets added to, it has to accommodate more than that. If it's on-site septic, that becomes something that has to be investigated. Can it handle the additional people? So that's one of the reasons why we've included the wastewater permit, not just whether it accommodates the number of people there are now, but as we look to the future, whether or not it can accommodate any kind of expansion. So what we've done is, we're now in the summary portion of this presentation, and this is a combined heat map of all the schools. So here you have the model program here, and here you have all 7 schools, and you can kind of see based on the green, yellow, and red how they measure up. And I know it's, you could say it's not fair to have Mary Hogan there because it's a much bigger school, but it does have these spaces that support the program. You can see a preponderance of red and here, because very few of the elementary schools have art or music programs, or spaces rather, not programs. You can also see in here, quite a bit of these are undersized. If you look at conference rooms, only 3 of the schools have any kind of conference rooms. None of them have mail copy centers. Shoreham doesn't have a staff room, as far as we can tell. And you can see here, some of them have limited numbers of classrooms. So we thought this was just a good graphic way to kind of get a sense of how the schools compare to each other, and also how they compare to the model. This is the second half of it that includes the public spaces. You can see all of them, 4 of the schools don't have a book room, which is where the level readers go. Lobbies, stage, two of the schools, or 3 of the schools don't have stages in the multi-purpose room. And some of them that do are incredibly small. You can see the difference in size between Salisbury stage and some of the other ones. The kitchens, look at Ripton's and Shoreham's kitchens. I mean, those are micro. And for whatever, I don't know why, but for whatever reason, they just remain very small. Many of the schools don't have any room for school-based clinicians. No guidance in 2 of the schools. Like you can see here, special ed, the way it was labeled on our plans that we got back, they all had special ed. We don't know, maybe the guidance counselors sitting in there and all that. But you can kind of see how they measure up to each other and how they measure up to the program, the model program.
This is just sort of taking a look at the redevelopment potential slide and then aggregating that into, again, how do the schools sort of compare with each other? Which ones have more significant challenges for development on the site than others, whether it be its location, the site size, its grade or slope. In other words, how steep is the site? How easy would it be to add on to a school? How difficult would it be? Water and wastewater capacity, those types of things we were able to sort of compare and contrast the schools. Again, in relation with each other, with the view toward whether or not they're very amenable to being added on to, accepting more students, accepting more occupants, and that sort of thing.
And finally, we just summarized the costs here. This is simply adding up the costs. It's about $17.5 million. And as we said before, it does not include additions and renovations, doesn't include hazardous material mitigation, and because the thermal, the insulation issue is so specific to each school, does not include that. But it gives you a general ballpark for what the cost of just maintaining these schools, bringing them up to a modern standard would be. Obviously, the biggest one is Mary Hogan, but all the other ones, you can see are of a similar scale in terms of the amount of work they needed. These are projected costs through 2020. So right now, cost escalation is about 4% a year for construction. So if you take 4% of 17 million, you're about, what's that, 426, about $680,000. So that's the cost of, like, say, each year, and that multiplies. So 4% on whatever the number is. So, like, if you don't do anything, for example, this year, next year it'll be $680,000 more, and then it'll be 4% of that new number, and it just keeps going and going. So there is a cost of not doing anything, and but I think being thoughtful and methodical and doing it in an intelligent way is more important than rushing anything. So that concludes our presentation. So now we'd like to open it up for questions and answers. We have a microphone here, and I guess it's been asked is that if you can have the questions be directly related to our presentation about the facility report, and we'll try and make sure everybody gets a chance.
Jason from Middlebury, and I just have a question around some of the assumptions that are driving this analysis and then the analysis to come. So some of it's for you and some of it isn't. In the beginning, when you talked about sort of the guiding principles of this process, you identified things like the wild space and things like that, but I didn't see an analysis of those assets that was based here. The other question that I have really is around this idea of equity. in our strategic vision for the district, that's in our flyer here, foundational principles, all of our language in the district talks about equity, not equality. And we're using an equality yardstick when we're doing this asset mapping of our schools. So at what point do we anticipate taking that sort of more nuanced analysis of what each school offers to our diversity of learners based on their needs, as opposed to a single idea of a model program, which I know is much easier to quantify for this purpose, but isn't really in line with the language of our strategic vision. Does that make sense? Super short.
Yeah. The second question, I think you'd have to, Peter, you might want to tackle. We're architects, so we look at buildings, and so we're just trying to assess the buildings relative to the program. Because one of the guiding principles was creating spaces that support the educational program. So having an art room to support art, it's not, it's not a leap, Now, whether art, like I said, could be delivered in a high-quality way and create an equitable experience and access for students without an art room, it presents an extra challenge for the district, but it's not that it can't be done. Relative to your first part of your question, which was access to nature, you're right, we did not include that as a criteria in this presentation. But the feeling was that many of the small elementary schools are in these rural areas and have, they're on greenfield sites and they have woods and they have fields, but we didn't actually assess do they have nature trails or what's the biodiversity on the site. So you're correct.
Hi, my name is Fran Putnam. I have a question about the insulation and energy efficiency of the buildings. I was pleased to see that you noted that there was a problem, but I'm concerned that that wasn't quantified, because I think that's something that really needs to be taken into consideration for each of these schools going forward. It's not just a frill, it's not just a little add-on. I think it's essential. So you said that it wasn't done because it was too hard to do because they're all so different, but when is that going to be done? When are we going to know what needs to be done and that it's going to be taken seriously?
Great question. So what we've found, and this is not a dodge, but on several projects when we've done energy modeling, we've found that, for example, in some schools, insulating the walls the payback can be 30, 40 years, whereas the roof, you get a huge bang for your buck. We could make the assumption that, just bring every building up to the R values for walls and roofs, and that we've done that before on projects. But to answer your question more specifically, once we get into the reorganization options, the schools that are designated for redevelopment, there'll be a deeper dive done to those, and we'll have a better, those costs will be included as part of that effort.
Would it include solar also? Solar, would it include solar also when you get to the later stage?
Yeah, that's always a consideration. Interestingly enough, in September, the state's going to adopt a new energy code, and in that code, any building, and I don't know how it'll affect renovations and at what point they'll trigger this, but the energy guidelines require solar for any building over a 20,000 foot floor plate. So it could even get triggered by the code, but yeah, we'll certainly need to look at that.
Hi, I'm Yvonne Boyer. I just have a question about the certain things that we were looking at within the school, and it looked like you were doing a classroom per grade. And I'm just curious if there is any example in the state of a school that has only one classroom per grade and has all of those facilities that you guys are measuring? Because I feel like the answer is probably no, and that I'm just wondering, in that like ideal capacity, if we're only looking at a school that has one classroom per grade, what would the cost per pupil for that be? Because I think that's probably the reason why our sort of rural schools haven't had those, and why we do have an art room that's also a language room, that's also a room where people can go and read if they're at a higher level. So that's my question.
Thanks. So, you know, it's funny, sometimes we have clients and they say, can you take us to a really well-resourced, innovative school, elementary school in Vermont? Like, show us one, because we want to see what that looks like. And we say no. Because the school has, this state rather, has not invested in education facilities since 2007, and even before that, they weren't really funding, you know, at 30%, everybody was just trying to keep the heat on and the water out. So there are, it's sad, it's kind of sad. There are not a lot of great examples of high quality, innovative, well-resourced elementary schools in Vermont. So maybe this is an opportunity.
Yes, Todd Kincaid from Cornwall. Thank you very much for your very detailed report. Really appreciate it. I spaged through way too many of the 350 pages.
Thank you.
It had two major questions for you. One, in all those $17 million of costs tonight, you didn't talk about the three different priorities that are in the report. And especially my second question is, why aren't you talking about only about $1.5 million for the priority one versus the $17 million for the whole total?
Well, I think, you know, certainly the report does address that, and I would, again, this is not a dodge, but certainly looking at how we can best summarize what we found. You know, we talked about bringing the building completely up to modern standards, essentially, without adding programs, without adding size, and without completely renovating it. But yes, yeah, the slides do not include sort of the top priority items, which would be, for those who haven't seen the report, things that would include life safety or code compliant sorts of issues, which are but a part of the overall cost of bringing these schools up to modern standards. So yes, the priority one issues, those that are deemed most critical, certainly have a much lower price tag.
Hi, Pierre Cassiers, I live in Cornwall. The question I have, and on behalf of the 1 in 10 men and 1 in 75 women or whatever who might be colorblind in the room, I'm very colorblind and I don't process color things very well. When I looked at that one where you showed all the schools, I didn't see one standing out more than another. I saw a lot of different things. I'm wondering if you're willing to go back to that slide and summarize for us if you feel any of the spots have, your expert opinions, any of those spots have particularly stand out either positively or negatively compared to the other, because I myself couldn't compute it. Thank you.
Sure. So, so I think the two schools that stand. What's that?
The next slide.
The next, this one. Well, there's two of them that are. Oh, this one.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the two schools that have, well, the three schools that have red was there's significant challenges with Ripton in terms of its remoteness, in terms of investing in that school. You know, enlarging it, making it bigger, or you know, getting more kids there, is the remoteness and the access. For Shoreham, the size of the site and the steep slopes are in red, and the drainage in Bridport. All the other colors are yellow or green. you know, when it comes to, like, for example, wastewater or water, we'd have to do further investigation to see if, you know, if something's permitted for 100 kids or 100 people, and now you want to have 150 or 175 on site, you know, further investigation would have to happen to see whether the, if it's on-site sewage system, whether, or septic system, that could, you know, could be modified or upgraded. So the next step is, you know, because of the cost to really get into detail in every single school, what we want to do is do enough study to sort of identify the big issues. And so the next step when we get into the reorganization options, if one of these schools is we say, hey, you know, this would make a lot of sense to add to this one, then there'll be a deeper dive into that one. But we don't want to, just because of your resources not spending too many of them, we didn't want to have to do a deep dive into all the schools. We want to see which ones require that.
Hey, this is Chris Kamick. I have what's a two-part question, or one part's sort of a statement and the other part's a question. So a statement, just looking back at this slide, is the remoteness and access from Ripton then have to be overcome by whatever transportation systems put in place if Ripton isn't a school. That's just a statement looking at this slide. More broadly, my question is, will the costs of getting any of our schools up to that well-resourced 21st century learning environment, are those covered in the numbers you addressed here? And given the shake of your head, no, it seems like that should be the number that we're looking at for the facilities as we go forward. And I would challenge the board to have whatever schools we end up with out of this be the examples that these guys can bring people to from the rest of the state. Because if we're looking at consolidating and trying to roll things together, the benefit should be that environment for our kids.
And I know it wasn't a question, but I will say that what we typically do is first we do the deferred maintenance study like this, and then we do, you know, the renovations and additions to a building, and then we combine those to come up with a total project cost. And the reason why we do that is because when we don't do that, guess what the first question people ask is, they say, wait a minute, beep beep, back up the truck. What would be the cost of just fixing up the building? And so that's why we do this, so we can answer that question. And then people understand, okay, we know we have to put $1.5 million in just to get systems up to modern standards, and we're going to spend X to accommodate more students or to provide a better resourced, better aligned facility with 21st century learning. Oh, go ahead.
Hi, Joe McVeigh from Middlebury with a comment and then a question. Just for those of you whose friends and neighbors were interested in this presentation but weren't able to come, a reminder that the whole thing has been filmed by Middlebury Community Television. Kurt Broderson, who's the executive director, tells me this will be up on MCTV's YouTube channel within, about this time tomorrow. So you could, if you want to see it again, or you could do that, and maybe Peter Burrows, there could be a link from the website. I'm very grateful for all of the excellent work that you've done looking at our 7 elementary schools, and perhaps I'm jumping the gun here in looking to what the next steps are, but I'm just curious, is there a plan in place to do a similar facilities evaluation for the middle school and the high school?
Yes.
So, Peter, yeah. Yes.
So I would say, what this leads to is a bond in the future, and that would certainly include a look at the high school and middle school. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Steve Cash. And to follow up on Chris's question, follow kind of square footage per school numbers. My question would be, to get to that optimal learning environment for children in this district, does this district need more square footage or less?
Less. A lot less.
You're partially addressed my question, which was in the April meetings last year, they had a study by looking at both the school dude and the re-arch, and I believe you used re-arch for some of your estimates.
Correct.
And Mary Hogan was much bigger in this graph than what you showed, just to bring it up to what we would want our kids to be in with no additional improvements or other things like that, correcting major issues. Even your level 3s are pretty major to me. I was surprised at the cost difference and things like that. Can you talk about the difference between these 3 studies? It looks like yours is more thorough than the others, but more limited in what you were focusing on. Is that a correct thing?
Yeah, the numbers I believe that you're referring to were done based on just strictly like take the square footage of the building, multiply it by a renovation cost per square feet, and there was no look at the different systems. So what we've done now is a bit more refined and a little more accurate.
Rebecca Kerr from Shoreham. I'm just curious, like tapping off of the other gentleman on the other side, if we go through and we make our model schools, what does our maintenance look like yearly, or are we going to be back here in 50 years trying to figure out another plan B?
Well, that's a great question. So a lot of times people say to me, okay, we're going to spend all this money, we're going to build this school or renovate this school, then what? And I always say, well, do you own a house? You know what that's like? Like, it's constant maintenance and upkeep, and once you get to the end, you go back to the beginning. That's what owning the school's like. And, you know, we build schools, you know, out of much longer lasting materials than your house, and they're built to last. I mean, so they're definitely less maintenance than your house, but buildings only last a certain amount of time. Windows last, you know, if you're lucky, you get 25, maybe 30 years out of them. HVAC units, the manufacturer will tell you 15 to 20 years. We go into schools that have 50-year-old HVAC units. Everything wears out. So flooring wears out, lights, everything. So if you got 50 years, if you spent a bunch of money and redid the district, you would be back here, and you'd still have to make investments every year, and you know, 50 years would be a very long time, would be too long between investments.
Barry Bailey from Salisbury. In looking at the numbers that it's going to cost just to bring things up to code, I have some real concerns as to where this goes from here, because this isn't pennies, this is a lot of money. And if you take a couple of schools and you decide, okay, we're going to put an addition on here, we're going to do some renovation, I'm concerned about the money perhaps also being put into the schools you're not going to select, because those are going to go back to the town. And is the town going to get a building that needs $1.5 million before they can repurpose it or mothball it? But they don't have that in a budget because the budget is for the schools that are going to get the additions. So I'm really appreciative of the fact that you've been very thorough with the numbers. But I wonder what happens to the schools that don't get chosen for this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question that I don't have an answer for. our focus is on what's the best path forward. And there are going to be, just to answer some of the concerns raised before, I mean, our inputs into this process are one part of it. The administration is going to have to look at impact on staffing, impact on transportation, and I think factored into that is going to have to be, okay, what happens to the schools afterwards? And it may not be a satisfactory answer, but I think it has to be addressed.
What does the new model school cost?
I knew somebody would ask that.
9 million or 10?
Yeah, very good. About I would say 9 or 10 million, 8 to 10 million, and plus land costs, which, if you do it on an existing site, you don't have less land costs, but yeah, about that.
But for how many students?
That would be like 150. So you could actually, if you looked at that district map, you could probably fit 3 of your small schools into.
I thought you said 200.
For which? For the...
For the model school.
No, the model school is 1 section per grade. It's like 150. What I was saying was that if you really looked at if you followed the guiding principles and you said full-time staffing of librarian and nurse and all those things, then you're talking about a 2 section per grade school. And that would be more like 250. That would be double the size. It would be anywhere, depending on how you do the math, it'd be a bigger school. That would be more than 10 million. But it would also be, they tend to be more efficient in other ways. In other words, you just do for a 1 section per grade school, you do 1 element, an elementary size gymnasium. You do the same size gymnasium for the bigger school. In other words, you might have to do with a bigger school, 2 section per grade school would be, probably do a cafeteria because you're going to have so much use. My wife is a school-based clinician at Virgins. Virgins is a 2 section per grade school, for example. They exist. And they have a separate cafeteria, separate gym.
I just want to jump in. We're a little after 8, and we promised folks we would do a 6 to 8 presentation, so maybe one more question, and then folks will be around to chat if you'd like to chat further.
It's a really long question, Peter. Good evening, Willem Jewett from Ripton. I just want to test what I'm taking away here in terms of the numbers. I have sat on some of these boards at times. What I see are numbers that are helpful in terms of deferred maintenance. What I'm having a hard time understanding is the value of the so-called model school, because none of the schools fit the model at all. And as you dive down into the heat map, Mary Hogan is 2.5 times the size of the model school on square footage, and I didn't really calculate out the number of students, but multiples larger, whereas every other school in the district is 50 to 60 or 70% the size of the model school. Not a great surprise that Mary Hogan has most of the things in the model school basket. Also not a great surprise that a lot of the other ones are deficient in those manners. So I don't quite understand this model that doesn't, it's kind of like the average doesn't really define anything. How does that help as a planning tool?
So, like I said, we started with the guiding principles, and then we modeled those in terms of that building program. Say, what kind of school would support those guiding principles in terms of, having spaces that support these full range of program offerings. And you're right, most of the schools don't measure up to the model program. It's the ideal that the district is striving for and wants to, will we get there? Maybe not. Maybe we will. But that's the purpose of it, is to see how all the schools measure up to it. We had to come up with a way to evaluate each school, and we're doing it against the model the model school, you're right, none of them actually meet every criteria, but like I said, when clients ask me to take them to a model school in Vermont, I tell them there aren't any. There aren't any cutting-edge, innovative, 21st century learning environments, elementary schools in Vermont. What's that?
Where do you point to?
Well, New Hampshire has some. I've been to some in Maine. I mean, I could arrange a trip, it'd be fun.
Well, I think we'll end there. We're a little after time. I think we got some cookies and some refreshments left outside. But more importantly, we've got lots of information available on our website. If you got a flyer coming in, or if you didn't, please pick one up. That'll direct you to where things are on the website and what information is available. Some of us will be around if you want to ask questions. But otherwise, thanks very much for your interest and for turning out tonight. Have a good evening.